Good evening. I'm David Victor. I'm a professor of innovation and public policy at UC San Diego. I'm also co-chair of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Energy. It's really my pleasure to welcome you here tonight to this session on reaching for the stars with nuclear fusion, literally star power. With me to my immediate left is Kim Budil, who's the director of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, very much in the news recently with this new announcement. We'll get to that in just a moment. And next to Kim is Philippe Knoche, who is CEO of Orano, which is one of the world's most important nuclear fuels and materials companies, very familiar with the nuclear industry. Just a reminder, we are being live streamed and recorded, and they're reporting press in the room. So this is very much on the record, our discussions this evening. If you want to tweet and Instagram and do other things about tonight's session, good luck. But hashtag is WEF23. Hashtag, just please add that so that it connects into the larger WEF Twitter feed. So this is an extraordinary announcement after December 5th, just about a month ago, a little more than a month ago, about achieving ignition at your facility. So maybe we could start, Kim, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing at this facility and what the achievement was back in December, and then we'll continue on from there.
Sure. So the facility at my laboratory is called the National Ignition Facility. It's the world's largest, most energetic laser. So to put some context on that in terms of scale, the laser facility itself, the footprint is about the size of 3 American football fields, and the facility is 10 stories tall at its tallest extent. So that laser produces about 2 megajoules of laser energy that goes into the target. What we do with all that energy is we concentrate it down into a very small volume, so we get to extremely high temperatures and densities. And in the experiments we reported on from December 5th, we use a very small gold can. We focus 192 laser beams into that can to generate an X-ray bath. Those X-rays bathe a little tiny capsule that's in the center, about the size of a BB, that's filled with deuterium and tritium, hydrogen fuel. As the outer surface of that capsule, which is made out of diamond, blows off, the inner surface moves in. So as that surface moves in, it compresses the hydrogen fuel, and if you compress it fast enough to a high enough temperature and density and hold it together long enough, the fusion reactions start to become self-sustaining. So what we saw on that particular experiment is that we produced 3 megajoules of fusion energy for 2 megajoules of laser energy in, for a gain of about 1.5. So that's the first time in a laboratory that anyone has ever produced more fusion gain out than the energy put into the capsule. Now that's not wall plug gain 1.5. So it takes about 300-ish megajoules off the grid to run the laser. This facility wasn't built to be a power plant. It was built to be a scientific facility. But the demonstration of that self-sustaining fusion reaction is a really big deal and demonstrates for the first time that fundamental building block of what a fusion energy system could look like.
One more question here. So you've got this, you use a huge amount of energy. You've got this giant facility. Help us understand what the time scale would be. We'll talk about money and investment and so on later on, but help us understand what the time scale would be to bring this to commercial reality. The idea of this kind of confinement and fusion has been around at least since the 70s, maybe earlier, depending on how you count. So that's already quite a long time. Is this something that, with the right investment plan, you think is decades away, a decade away, next week?
Definitely not next week. And probably not a decade, probably 2 decades or 3 decades. Mostly because scaling from where we are today to what you would require for a power generating plant is a pretty significant challenge. Now, all the elements of that challenge are plausible. We have strategies and approaches that we think will work for making a much more efficient driver, for making targets that are simpler at the scale and cost that you would need to be economically viable. So you need to be able to do this not once a week, but 10 times a second. So that's a pretty big scale up. And you need the balance of plant. So you need the reactor vessel, as it were, that will capture the neutrons that are produced and turn those into heat that you can then use to drive your power generating system. So really what has to happen now is we need a scientific and investment strategy that allows us to make progress on all of these fronts simultaneously. So we'll continue working on the targets and the fusion source, as it were, working to make the gains higher. This was gain 1.5. We need gain of a few hundred to make an energy system. Again, that's plausible. We have pathways to work toward that, but that will require research. To make lasers that are much more efficient, that we actually know how to do. Our laser was built based on 1980s laser technology. So lasers are much more efficient now, and there are much better strategies, but we need to demonstrate those and build, prototype beamlines, and then begin to work on all of the systems that would go into a power plant. So the time scale is almost a direct function of resource investment.
Okay, and the beamlines are these lasers that then ultimately cause the ignition inside.
Yes.
So I want to bring you in, Philippe, on this. Your company is in the middle of the commercial nuclear reactor business. You supply fuel, you take fuel away, you recycle it, you provide more fuel, and you have also, over the last few years, started to build up what would be a company that would supply the fuel to small modular reactors, another nuclear technology that's been in the news. Not fusion technology, but a fission technology.
Fission
so when you heard this announcement, was this, you expected this to happen, or does this result in you thinking, okay, at some point in the near future, we need to start thinking about nuclear materials for this kind of business? Help us understand how you saw the commercial opportunity unfolding from these kinds of announcements.
Oh, first, it's a big step. So we were not expecting specifically it to happen. I mean, of course, monitoring it, being in the nuclear sector, but it's clearly a big step, and we give kudos to the lab having done that the first time. We have a coefficient of 1.5. We are already, we'll go back to fission, but a small supplier to fusion, especially for fusion materials. You mentioned the equipments, but indeed you need tritium, you need deuterium, you need these materials. You also need, for example, beryllium in certain instances, depending on what's your configuration. And these materials need to be supplied. It's not huge quantities, but today this market is not existing. So we are monitoring and sometimes have contracts to supply that. And also, most interestingly, also to maintenance and to think about the maintenance of these equipments. Because once you have radioactivity and radioactive reactions, you have neutrons, and these neutrons interact with the materials around, and you can get radioactive materials from the surrounding, from the equipments, and then maintenance becomes more difficult. So you need to have the concepts of how you will maintain this, same thing as when we have to maintain our spent fuel facilities, for example. You do that remotely, but you have foreseen that in advance. So we have small interactions on this, and certainly, so we are already present, and we think also but it is of interest. It's not going to be our biggest market next year or in the next years, but it's really of interest in order to reach a low carbon economy. It's also interesting, and that will be my last point, maybe you are a professor on innovation, can comment on that, the fact that...
My job is to ask the question, just to answer the question. Keep our roles clear here.
Question. It's interesting to see that now we have two tracks in fusion, with magnetic confinement and with laser confinement. And it's interesting in terms of innovation to see how these two tracks have things in common, like materials, but are also competing in terms of science.
Let me ask you just one more follow-up question on that. So we have several ways to make a fusion reaction, assuming we don't move to the sun, which I think would be short-lived. So you can do this inside a nuclear weapon, where you have a fission reaction that makes the fusion reaction inside. That's a thermonuclear bomb. We're not doing that. You have a way of doing inertial confinement, which is what you're doing with lasers. It can be also done with particle beams and so on. And then you have this other strategy with these so-called tokamak reactors, where you use very powerful magnets to confine that. And there's been in the news a startup coming out of MIT, Commonwealth Fusion, that has been doing that there. I guess my question to you, Philippe, is it seems like the laser facilities, this is a national laboratory. You've been a supplier to the ITER project, which is a French government-backed gigantic tokamak reactor.
It's an international project, in fact, but it's happening.
But how do you see the companies that are going to take this forward? Because those are both examples of basically state-backed projects where huge amounts of capital coming fundamentally from government are applied to the task here. Is that the way of the future, or do you see this as a private sector activity, or we don't know?
I would say both, because innovation is, there's so much creativity in the private companies, and from what we know, fusion startups and companies have raised billions, 2 to 4 billions, according to what we see in new money for private funded fusion research, which is approximately the same amount seen from today as advanced fission reactors. So it's not ridiculous at all. Of course, when you compare with what is put into renewables or even fossil projects, it's nothing, but private money is important. And in particular, if you compare it also with lab money, which is somehow scarce and can be in the dozens of millions, so much more. So this private money is important, and also because these companies bring sometimes really innovation in some areas, not maybe in the full in the full system, but in certain materials, also in artificial intelligence simulation of fusion and therefore on how you manage that. So there are different geometries, different confinement strategies. So it's really interesting because there is interaction. Sometimes it's people coming from MIT or from labs that are doing this. So it's the same ecosystem. Really, I really think in general for innovation, but especially for nuclear, we need that both private and public funding.
So let me put some of these numbers in perspective. Several $1 billion of private money raised for these private fusion projects. Last year, the world invested about $1 trillion in conventional oil and gas, actually a little more than $1 trillion in clean energy. It's the first time that the clean number has been bigger than the traditional fossil number. Help us understand, Kim, how much did your facility cost, and what do you see as the commercialization model? Because the facility has a lot of purposes. Not all of them are related to making energy that ultimately could go on the grid. So where's the private sector in this?
So it cost about $3.5 billion to build the facility. It was a very leading edge, very high risk project. When we began the project to build the laser, 7 of the critical technologies that were required to make it work didn't exist. They had to be invented along the way. So this is the kind of project that public sector investment is really good at. Very large scale, able to manage the risk over time, and able to bring resources to bear at the laboratory from a wide range of disciplines. So my laboratory has 8,000 employees. So I have lots of engineers and physicists and chemists and material scientists. So when there was an issue, you were able to call on people, to triage the issue and really work towards solutions. We spend somewhere around $350 million a year running the facility. And that's a pretty traditional number when you look at operating expenses. It's about 10% of the capital cost of the facility. But as you said, our laser was not built for energy generation. It was built as the backbone of a national security program. And so if we want to take this forward, public-private partnerships are really going to be essential. And I think it is public and private. If I look at the private sector fusion companies that have already been spun out, they have needs for expertise and certain specific skills that it would be cost prohibitive for them to develop within a startup framework. So they can partner with the laboratories to get access to that expertise and that capability. In the inertial confinement fusion case, it's essential. We have the only facility on the planet that can do this work. So as we want to advance the cause of inertial confinement fusion, we need to create an ecosystem where any of the private sector players in this area who want to try to commercialize this technology can work with us to help advance the target designs, to think about laser architectures or other driver architectures, to benefit from our expertise in what will be required to operate a facility at this scale. And so I'm hopeful that we'll start seeing significant public sector investments in the energy application of this technology. And we already have several companies that have been formed around inertial confinement fusion that are starting to explore partnerships with us on how to take the technology.
So they would work on parts of this, on lasers or the optics and the amplifiers for the lasers and things like that. That's the place where they would have collaboration.
For the next few years, it's essential that we work together because the challenge in increasing the gain in these targets, making them more efficient and making them simpler, which will make them ultimately more cost-effective for an energy application, that work is the same whether I'm thinking about astrophysics or stockpile stewardship or energy applications. At some point, those paths diverge. And so I need to work with all these programs in concert with one another right now, and then at some point I need to know there's an off-ramp for the energy application to be supported independently.
Because the core money for this came from, in effect, the weapons program, because the weapons program has an interest in understanding what happens in those plasmas at the point of nuclear fusion
Yes.
for purposes of making sure the nuclear weapons continue to operate properly. So when you think about, you have a lot of ongoing support from the federal government for the weapons program. What's the level of support for the fusion, for the commercial fusion side of it, or is the paths not diverged yet, so you're not worried about that?
I worry about it. It's really my job to worry about everything.
You're on the record, too.
On the record. So the public sector investment for inertial fusion energy is actually quite small right now. And part of that is that if we couldn't ignite these targets in the laboratory, it didn't matter. So until we had that fundamental building block, there was reluctance to build a big program on developing the other technologies that surround it. So we have worked very hard and diligently over 60 years. So 60 years ago, the original proposal was made that you could use lasers to create these conditions in the laboratory. The gentleman who made that prediction still works at our lab. I think he's hanging in there to make sure that we were successful.
I want to know more about what he's eating, too. This
Exactly.
Pretty effective.
You just think about the leap of imagination. Lasers had just been invented, so it wasn't like this was a well-known technology the way it is today, ubiquitous in its utilization. So the public sector money for inertial fusion energy is quite small, and the Department of Energy is beginning to build that program. And our hope is that with this great announcement, this really important building block, we'll be able to increase support for that element of the program and bring many more players to bear. This is a really challenging technology path. As I said, it's plausible, but we need the best people working at this, and we need lots and lots of ideas going forward.
So let me talk about public support, bring you into this part of the conversation, Philippe, which is there seems to be a lot of evidence the public is more supportive of nuclear, partly because of what we've seen here in Europe. We've seen license extensions on Belgian reactors and a variety of other reactors. We see public support swing the other direction now in the United States. Help us understand, from your point of view, Philippe, the role of the rest of the commercial nuclear business in sustaining public support. Do we need to solve the nuclear waste problem, which is what your company is working on? Do we need to be worried about the safety of irradiated materials in the middle of this 10-meter wide capsule, basically, where this tiny gold target is sitting in Kim's facility? Are those problems that you're worried will affect public support, or not worried about it?
I'm not so worried. I mean, there's some real common sense. The problem was with nuclear that misinformation came, and we really had difficulties dealing with that. And as engineers, we had difficulties in public debates. Going into nuclear waste lasts long, and this goes into eternity. And engineers are not good at talking about eternity. So what can we do to reduce waste, which is already in so small quantities? It's less than a coin per person, even in France, where more than 70% of electricity comes from nuclear. So I'm not worried. I'm concentrating every day on safety and on reducing waste, but the quantities of waste are so small that it's not an objective challenge. It's a public opinion challenge, and therefore working on public opinion and convincing public opinion with the right arguments is something that now the nuclear industry has learned, and quite efficiently. I don't think it's by chance that public opinion are changing. Of course, there's war in Ukraine, there is climate, but 30 years ago there was no such a climate conscience in public opinions, although everybody knew that it was going to be a challenge. So I really think that we can tackle, and as regard fusion, it's more a question of managing timing, because we are, for long cycle industries, so people can get really frustrated. It takes so long, it takes 60 years to come to that, it will take 2 decades more. So it's more about managing expectations and making sure that people keep working, even if it's long work. Okay,
I want to go to the questions and maybe here in the audience. I see one right here. Let's keep it super. Can we bring the microphone to the gentleman, fourth row back on the aisle? Here, wait for just a second. The microphone's right behind you. Tell us who you are and ask your question briefly, please, sir.
Hello, I'm Zebulon Vlagazi. I'm a physicist, nuclear physicist from South Africa. Question is, you said that this is old 80s technology. What was the technical step change that made you achieve what hadn't been achieved 2, 3, 4 years, or decades before?
So I say there are 3 things. For a long time, we've understood what the barriers were to igniting the targets. It's getting them to implode spherically and stay very round. It's getting the shells to be very perfect so that they don't send cold material in that turns the fusion reactions off. And it's delivering the laser energy very uniformly so that the other two conditions can be achieved. So we've had extremely incredible advances in our target fabrication capabilities, and our ability to control the way we deliver the energy from the laser, and our use of computing to really design the targets and optimize based on the data we're getting. Increasingly, we're using things like machine learning to help develop our models so we can use the vast data that we get on these experiments to really improve the predictivity of our models and help guide our experimental programs. And then in the end, we've been steadily increasing the amount of laser energy we can get out of a laser. And it turns out a little bit of energy goes a long way in these reactions too. So that's been a big help.
And the number 1.5 that both of you were excited about, that's an important number because it's for the first time that this approach has generated more energy than it consumes, which seems like going in the right direction. Next question here, please. Other questions after the gentleman here? Please.
Hi, name's Uwe Häuser. I'm an editor with the German weekly Die Zeit. And I recently founded a sustainability platform, and it's from that perspective that I'm asking this. Since your idea has been around for so long, and there have been, for example, under Bill Clinton, there has been a lot of enthusiasm, which then was a little disappointed. Same with AI, by the way.
Yes.
It came in these circles. So I'm wondering, is now the time when, the state should really, not only the American state, but basically all over, should unite in supporting this project and cut the 2.5 to 3 decades into 1.5?
I think yes. We need great people and great ideas all pulling in the same direction, and this is a moment to really generate that kind of collective action on this front. There are many types of technology challenges, and we have many international partners in the work that we do now, and so there's already a nascent community that can come together around these challenges. Similarly, in the magnetic fusion approaches, a very international community working on those challenges. There are some nice attributes to inertial confinement approaches, not just because it's what my lab does. We also work on magnetic fusion, so we love all kinds of fusion at our laboratory. But a unique attribute of the inertial confinement approach is that the driver is separate from the energy generating target. So for things like maintenance and sustainability of the plant, it's a different challenge than magnetic fusion. And so I think there are real opportunities pushing both of these paths forward for us to learn from each other and for us to bring this technology to the foreground much faster. So I'm an optimist by nature. So I think it is the moment to lean in and really tackle these hard problems, right? I mean, our patience may be extraordinary when I say 60 years, but the best people are drawn to the hardest problems. And so we've learned a lot over that time.
Just two quick follow-up questions on this. First, can you help level set expectations? Seems like we had a week of press cycle about your success. Maybe people reacted a little bit, but it's a big deal. If we doubled funding or whatever, I guess right now the Biden administration has $50 million in their moonshot on fusion. Is $50 million too small, too big? If we had a lot more money, as the question implied, could we actually shorten the development times, or is it one of these things where people need to kind of work on a problem for a while?
Well, the investment is really important because that's how you get people focused on the problem and give them the freedom to really pursue the R&D that's required to advance the science and technology. So $50 million is really a seed investment. It's being used to allow private sector companies to explore timelines to a fusion energy demonstration plant and to build a plan. It's not enough money to really do research with. And certainly it's not enough money to build large-scale scientific instruments with. I mean, this is really, it's all energy technologies face this barrier at some point. It requires significant hard capital to build a big facility or to invent a new technology line. So I'm hopeful that that's a starter investment from the Department of Energy, and that is going to grow significantly now that we have a plausible path forward, and that in combination with the money that's coming in the private sector, which is quite significant, we'll be able to really do that.
Let me ask you, Philippe, we may have time for one more question, so if you want to ask a question, put your hand up. But let me first, before we go to this question here, let me ask you about the relevance of ITER. So this is an $18, $20 billion project. I've lost track because the numbers keep going up. Because of the success that they've had at Livermore, does that project now become not that useful, or does it become more useful? How should we think about the value of this gigantic multinational tokamak, the magnetic fusion experiment that's still in progress?
It's still in progress. It's for the next decade as a target, but clearly as a demonstration, not as an industrial or commercial installation, but producing, billions of joules compared to megajoules. So it's a scale up. It's also considering a lot of aspects of these sophisticated systems need money also because you have a problem in one area that can be solved maybe with time or with other areas. And if you don't finance the other areas at the same time, the materials, the lithium production, and etc., for tritium, etc. So you have a lot of aspects that you need to finance and bring at the same time. So I'm sure that ITER can help somehow also some of the aspects of laser fusion, and I really think that we need to go there. We need all sources and all possible solutions for low carbon society in the long run.
Last brief question to you, sir. Please tell us who you are.
Vincent Omer from JMN News. We're discussing timelines earlier, like if it's a few decades away. We're just wondering what is on the other end of that. Like when fusion is here, would that mean that it's like fission energy, for example, and a base load power, relatively expensive, but then without the waste? Or is that the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? Like, is that kind of what we expect?
It's clean base load power. So it is one of the few pathways beyond fission that gets you base load power at scale.
And with no long-lived waste normally. I mean, if you run it well, you have no long-lived waste.
Abundant fuel availability.
And just help us understand technically, what happens right now is you have all these lasers, they work very briefly, you time them all within a trillionth of a second so that you have that perfect sphere on the target implode and generate the fusion reaction. Then you got to turn it off and you get the energy out of it. So the commercial reactor then does that at a cadence kind of every few hours, and then you...
10 times a second.
10 times a second, okay. Yep. So there's no interruption in terms of the output.
Right. Easy peasy.
While hopping on their left foot.
Just kidding.
We have just a couple minutes left. I want to just very briefly question.
Thank you. Philippe Knoche. I'm a member of the Swiss Parliament. My question is the following. Do you think fusion, the commercial reactor, will make the energy we have today for wind or solar or other renewable energy something as a transition energy, which means in 50 years maybe we won't need them anymore, and what we are building now we will distribute them, which could help to make the transition right now?
It's a very good question. Let me rephrase the question and put it to you, Philippe. Solar and wind bridge to fusion?
As an industrial electricity consumer, I already reduce, and the Orano reduces its carbon footprint by 30 and to 40% between 2015 and 2025. So, and for that, we need nuclear fission and we need the existing technologies. Your question is, as an industrial company, talking about within 50 years is a little bit a challenge, as I'm looking at scope 1 and 2 for 2025 and scope 3 for 2030. So it's kind of hard to think about 50 years. However, anyway, wind and solar installations, as well as nuclear reactors to a certain extent, they span for 60 years, but wind and solar don't have lifetimes of 50 years anyway, so you would have to replace them. So I don't think it's a no-brainer to build renewables today. It's a no-brainer to have nuclear fission today, because anyway, you will need them to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, and your installations will have to be replaced anyway by the time that the time horizons you are mentioning.
Okay, so you're not worried about oversupplying clean
No.
energy. Let me ask you very briefly, Kim.
Maybe don't forget, we need 10 times more low carbon electricity than we have today.
Let me ask you very briefly, you had this big announcement, 6 weeks old. Has this already changed the funding environment for being able to do more work of this type, or is it too early to tell?
I would say it's changed the vector for the funding environment. The absolute investment necessarily lags, particularly since the budget was decided a year ago for our facility.
Well, kids watching at home, you can work that into casual conversation. It's changed the vector of discussion. Please join me in thanking Philippe Knoche and Kimberly Budil.